for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present on this interesting congress you organized. And so my talk is about valuation-based forecast of pricing potential for innovative drugs in early clinical development phase. So I will take an economic perspective for investing for investors, but also biotech companies for investing in R&D projects. And economic value, just some background, economic value of innovation, of medical innovation depends on the future sales, that's clear. So what determines the future sales in the past, and I mean in the past until, let's say, 10 years, until 10, 15 years, mainly registration was sufficient, efficacy, proven efficacy and good safety approved for registration by FDA or EMA in Europe, and then you could in fact enter the market and sell your products. But since the last 10, 15 years, registration is only part of the equation. You need to really have reimbursement, and that means reimbursement is that the drug, with registration you have market authorization, you can sell the drug, but you need reimbursement, which means that the patient does not need to pay the drug himself, but the drug is paid by the payer, by the health insurance or by the government. So that is reimbursement. And as patients in the medical world, you need reimbursement to have your sales. There are only a few quite exceptions, but in general you need reimbursement. And reimbursement is based on, indeed, on clinical data, again, efficacy, safety, but also the broader outcomes like quality of life and real effectiveness, which is in fact the efficacy in the real life. An important component is cost effectiveness, which is the cost per quality. So in the Netherlands, we are willing to pay 80,000 euros for one quality gain. So that is what in England, it's 20 to 30,000 pounds per quality. So that is what we as a society are willing to pay for a gain in qualities. Budget impact is more what we can pay or what the authorities can pay. And that is based on annual cost per patient, but especially, of course, the annual cost on the national budget. So how many, and then you calculate the number of annual eligible patients in a country, and you can calculate the macro impact of introduction of a new drug. In some cases, other criteria are relevant, like equity, social values, especially in areas like orphan drugs and oncology. For instance, oncology, you have life-saving, end-of-life drugs. Because of the ethical complications in oncology, we are willing to pay more, or the payers are willing to pay a little more for the cost per quality. So the critical determinants for the development of a new drug is the expected indication of the new drug. In this study, we use an example in breast cancer. What is the positioning? Is it first, second, or third line? What is the expected comparator at time of launch? So that's the standard of care, and that's different than in a trial where you have often a placebo, but for reimbursement, it's really the standard care. And of course, what is the expectations on efficacy and safety of the product? And what is the expectations on the cost per quality? And what is the expectation on budget impact? So those are the critical determinants which you consider in your early phase development when you consider the economic component. Just an example of the ICER. The ICER is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which is the cost per quality. So in the Netherlands, an expensive drug, orphan disease for Spinraza, which was for SMA, the cost per quality was 1.7 million. And in order to come to a threshold of 80,000, the price needed to reduce from 240,000 to 36,000. So at that price, the ICER became 80,000 instead of 1.7 million. And of course, this is such a huge price discount that you can, if without any calculation, you know this 30,000 will not be sufficient to reward the investor for his return of his investment in this medical project. So in the short term, the authorities may benefit from discounts, but in the end, investors will shift to other areas for their investment. So in the end, it will, as a boomerang in the long term, come back and will this kind of price discounts will in fact limit medical innovation in the long term. Even if, especially in oncology drugs, so for orphan diseases, cost effectiveness is usually much higher than the ICER, but also in orphan drugs with oncology indication, then the ICER can be higher, but if not, still the budget impact can be quite sufficient. So even if the ICER is acceptable, still the budget impact on national level can be too much. So we must include these constraints in the proposed early phase forecast of a new product. So we have to accept that health authorities are not willing to pay a drug exceeding the ICER or cannot pay the drug because of limited budgets. But on the other hand, we have to deal with biotech companies who will require a minimum drug price to satisfy their investors. So we come to the business challenge. So we want to maximize the probability of reimbursement at an acceptable drug price at time of launch. So I'm taking the perspective here of an investor at, let's say, before phase 2 or even earlier in development, but ideally in phase 2, before phase 2. So at that time, you make a forecast of the potential market size and what is the acceptable price for the new drug at the early onset of this clinical development program. This analysis must include the constraints from the perspective of the payer, so the budget impact and the ICER, but also should consider the minimum drug price to satisfy their investors. So it's really optimizing approach. So the solution I present today is the integrated valuation model. It reflects the perspective of both the payer and the investor. And we illustrate the model by using breast cancer, advanced breast cancer, and we consider first, second, and third line. And the goal is indeed optimization of positioning and price of the new product. Some background about, because we're talking about the payer's perspective, which is the ICER and the budget impact, and we talk about the investor's perspective. And in fact, the payer's perspective is really from the economic perspective of Keynes, which is more a so-called socialistic perspective, looking from the public perspective based on control of government, while the investor is an international market where the free market is ruling the game. And that's really the free market, the liberal economics by Hayek and later Friedman are really. So we talk about different approaches in economics. Is the real socialistic approach applying health economics, and on the other hand, the liberal economics applying discounted cash flow models, which I will discuss later. So what we are going to do is bridging these concepts. So we're bridging the health economics concepts from, let's say, the Keynes approach with the more business economic valuation approach applied by investors. So in fact, the payers, the countries, you see a regulated market based on, let's say, public government, which is really a regulated market. But on the other hand, you have the international market, which is the market of the investors in biotech. And these are international market government. And here it's the invisible hand of the free market which is ruling the game. On the other hand, also the governments, they leave innovation to the business entrepreneurship in the international market. So that's really not much, and it's not an assumption, it's more a current situation, which you have to accept as it is. And medical innovation really relies on market mechanisms in the financial market, as I showed in the previous slides. And we deal with investors who determine a required return of investment, which determines the price, and that is based on the cash flows and the cost of capital. Cash flows is costs, R&D costs, later manufacturing costs, and cash flows is also the income, which is the sales of the product. Cost of capital is the risk that the investor is, the uncertainty which the investor is willing to take, that we discussed. So application of the integrated valuation model at the moment is I apply it mainly to orphan drugs for real orphan diseases or oncology drugs with an orphan indication. So small patient groups. And as I mentioned before, in these areas, on orphan areas, threshold can be often much higher than 80 or 100,000 per QALY. The budget impact can be, at least per patient, is quite high, but also on national level, it depends. The level usually not that much, but still there are so many products entering the market. So the overall budget impact can be quite high, and therefore governments are getting more and more cautious about orphan drugs. The reason why the prices are so high, in previous research we showed that it's not really excessive or too excessive. It's just the fact that if you develop a drug for an orphan indication with let's say 1,000 patients, the costs are nearly similar to the development of an antihypertensive drug, for instance, which you develop for millions of patients. So you have the same costs, but you have to distribute it over very few patients. So by definition, the cost per patient, so the drug price is much higher. In addition, we also have to consider more. It's often, especially in orphan diseases, much more difficult to collect the clinical evidence because of the heterogeneity of the systems. And we also have to consider a higher risk in a reimbursement. There's a higher budget impact and an ICER which is exceeding the threshold. So there's a high risk for the investor to get reimbursement for these drugs. And often innovation is more and more developed by small firms. So you have to incorporate so-called small firm premium into the equation, which increases the risk for the investor. So what are the key decision criteria? Here you see the criteria: efficacy, safety. In this case, we look at breast cancer, so it's really incremental gain in overall survival and progression-free survival. Product safety is important. Budget impact, drug price. Budget impact is calculated by the budget impact model, where we look at various levels. Level 1 is really the drug impact of the new drug. Level 2, you also incorporate co-medication. And level 3, you look also at substitution effects by reducing, for instance, hospitalizations. The drug price we calculate in the pricing matrix model, which really weight all the different criteria and establish a kind of break-even price. Cost effectiveness is a separate component in the pricing matrix model. It's the cost per QALY. And then that's really the perspective from the payer, but then we have to compare that price, which we have to compare that with the minimal price for the investor, and there we apply the discounted cash flow model. So this is more a visual display. So you see the different models are connected. So we have the pricing model, the pricing matrix model, the budget impact model, and we have the cost effectiveness analysis, and those are related. So for instance, if the pricing matrix level gives a certain price, then it also should mean that the cost effectiveness is still below the threshold of 100,000 euros per QALY. And if the prices increase, then also the budget impact increases. So these are intertwined models. And overall, these three, let's say the payer's perspective models, are linked to the discounted cash flow model. Because if we calculate, let's say, the price, the minimum price of the maximum price for the payer, that should, of course, should be sufficient to reward the investor. And therefore, we connect it in integrated. Therefore, it's called the integrated model. So the perspective of the investor, we use the discounted cash flow method, which is the standard approach for economic evaluation of biotech companies, of companies in general. And it's based, and we apply it now to determine, let's say, the economic value of a project. So we see the development of one product as a kind of a separate standalone project. We have the free cash flows, which are the sales from the pharmaceuticals, cost of research, manufacturing and marketing costs when the product is on the market, and the opportunity costs, which is called the cost of capital. Some background. So sales forecast is really the global population size. So you have to make an estimate of the global market. You have to look at the incidence of prevalence of the disease. In oncology, it's mainly incidence. So how many new patients every year are eligible for a drug? We look at the proportion of eligible patients, because it's not all patients get the treatment. Some patients have contraindications, or there are other reasons not to give the drug. Annual growth of the population is important. Uptake, so how many of the patients eligible are really going to use the drug? Usually it's around 80% in oncology, so quite high, and also a potential of label use, which means that if the patient is, usually you see development in third line, and then 5 years later the second line comes to the market. So that's for the time being, that can be an off-label use if the physicians are aware of the development of the drug as a second line. Then we have the costs, which is the standard cost for the research program, which of course needs to be fine-tuned depending on the disease area. And the product, this is also important. Of course, let's say 1 out of 100 products really enter the market to get registration. So it means with one successful product, you have to fund 99 failed projects. So incorporate the cost of failures, you incorporate into the discounted cash flow model. And by the discounted cash flow model, you calculate the break-even price. We put it at 0, where the net present value is 0, and that's just the price where the investor is satisfied and gets his return on investment back. So as I said, what is the return on investment? That's the risk. So if you put it on the bank, it's 4%. It used to be 4%, I unfortunately have to say, but that's the free interest rate. And if you invest in companies, of course, you have risk, so you want to have more in a return on investment. So for investing in pharmaceutical companies is 9%. In biotech, it's more risky, so you have 12%, and it can run up to 18%. So now we move it to the application in the breast cancer. So first of all, we are early in the development, so we try to develop various scenarios. So what is the expected? So it's all forecasting. So you look at as a general expected, so let's say the base case, but you incorporate the pessimistic and optimistic scenario for the expected clinical product profile of the new drug. So will it be 10% better than the existing drugs, in 10% increase of an overall survival, or 20%? And the focus is really on free survival, overall survival, and safety. That we discussed. We take as a consideration a 3-way comparison. So we take as comparator what is the previous innovative drug in first line, second line, third line, and what was the previous standard treatment. So it means the previous innovative drug was the most recent introduction, and that was compared to the previous standard treatment, as you can see. And then we make a 3-way comparison, which means if A is better than B and B is better than C, A is also better than C. And that is a kind of consistency measure in the model, and that is preferred over 2-way comparison. Then the data sources of the model, for the payer's perspective, we use country-specific data, because that's a country-specific issue anyway. In this case, we used country-specific data from the Netherlands. And international data are used for the investors model, which is the discounted cash flow model. Just an example of what was the definitions, the input values for the innovative drugs, the previous innovative drug and the previous standard treatment. So the two comparisons, you see, for instance, overall survival improved from 40.8 months to 56.5, progression-free survival. So there's the base case for the products. You see administration, also you can incorporate that, but that's not really driving the model. These are the data from the international model, so the discounted cash flow model. So you see population size. We always take several perspectives, but usually the European economic viable markets, Western Europe, Europe in general, US, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries. And we have data on the probabilities of trials, cost of marketing. We have data on the cost of the R&D development. We consider 95% probability of reimbursement, 95% eligible patients, and uptake 70% was 70% for the previous comparison. So the distribution between the most recent introductory drug and the previous one is 70%. So that's the weight of the two existing treatments in the model. Cost of capital, we take as the base case, we take the 12%, but we do an analysis also on 9%. So the results, it's important, this is to see. So this was the base case analysis. So we assume 30% improvement of progression-free survival, 20% in overall survival, and 10% in reduction of adverse events. And then you see from the investor's perspective, at first line, the daily treatment cost, we extrapolated everything to a daily treatment cost, even also IV, in order to make a comparison. So it's 14.7 euros, and you see second line, it increases, third line, it increases. And of course, the reason is in third line, you don't have so many patients anymore, and therefore the price has to be higher to satisfy the investor. So this is what you can see. And then we looked at what is the price, the minimal price, or the maximum price, I should say, for the payer. If we look only, if we incorporate all parameters in the model, like budget impact, efficacy, the weight of safety, then and incorporate the ICER as a discrete one, then if the ICER is above that's the cutoff point, if it's higher than the 100,000 euros, then there's no reimbursement. So you see first line treatment, it's much higher than the break-even price for the investor. So it's 269. So there you see you're quite comfortable in your pricing. If you go to second line, you see already the difference becomes smaller, and in the third line, in fact, the break-even price is below the investor break-even. So in fact, you cannot develop the product for the third line position. If we weight the ICER a bit, so we say, okay, it's not discrete, so you accept also threshold ICER higher than the threshold, then you see already that the prices can become much higher. And if you exclude the ICER, and this is important because in some countries like Germany, the ICER is not incorporated in the reimbursement process. So therefore, I do an analysis on that. And again, the prices become much more higher, which is the governments are paying too much more. But still, the third line, you see there a difference between 942 and 511. But still, you see it's approaching there. And there there may still be a potential for development, as you can see in the reimbursement. And in fact, those three elements give a good understanding of the potential of the price in the different positions. If you look at scenario analysis, we incorporated optimistic scenario, which means we give better 10% higher improvement in progression-free survival and overall survival and the reduction of adverse events. And in the pessimistic, it's the other way around. So you see changes there. You see also that efficacy is the main driver of the model. Adverse events, you see only difference of 2% up to 1%, but efficacy, you see the impact is much higher. It's really 12%, 27%, and 18%. So efficacy is the driver in your economic valuation. Some other indications, for instance, if you develop a third line and then later in 5 years, you go also to the second line, or you start in second line and later to first line, you see that has a high impact. It's not relevant for first line position, but for second line, you see compared to the initial prices, you see that the investor's price is reducing by 14% and substantially 37% in the third line position. So here you see that by having more indications, you have more patients, of course, and by that the price for the investor can drop. CAPM using the risk of 9%, of course, has also an impact. Reduces also the break-even price for the investor. And then we make some adjustments. What if we can because we are at the process of planning a clinical trial. So we still have possibilities in fine-tuning the trials, maybe reduce by that probabilities of failure or reduce costs. So you see 10% reduces also there substantially the prices, about 8% to 9%. And now other option, and this is the last scenario is you see very important, because if you are able, especially using diagnostic testing in breast cancer, and you are able to reduce time to market by 5 years, and there are examples of that by having a really very efficient recruitment program, and also reducing the cost by 5%, you can see you can substantially reduce the price for the break even, so you can make the drugs cheaper. Reimbursement still in third line, it's still not sufficient, but the actual data are getting closer to the break-even price. So the conclusion is that with this model, it's a practical strategic application. I show you of the integrated valuation model. I think it's the first model where you really combine the perspectives of the payer and the investor, and you can use it for optimization of positioning of the price of the product, testing scenarios for expected clinical profile. So it can be an internal tool at the early phase of development to get not only a clinical but also an economic sense of the direction, the future direction on the market and the potential. And then you can say, okay, we go to second line position, or we go to third line and develop also later a second line application. So it gives you an idea. Another option is I'm working also at early price negotiation with authorities. That's a separate issue, which I recently also presented to NICE in England. And that's and also this model can be also transparent tool in an early phase, where you can in a transparent way show on beforehand, for instance, in this case, the gap between the minimal price for the investor and the acceptable price for the payer. So in this case, you can see that in third line, it's very difficult to develop a profitable product, because the payers cannot or are not able to pay the high price for third line, and that price is not too excessive or something like that. It's just the minimal price for the investor. But if you can make it, show it with a model, it can be a useful tool also in this type of negotiations. But at the moment, it's really applying this model for early phase development with biotech companies, and especially also investors, of course, who can fine-tune the model to their future options. So by this, I come to the end of the presentation. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions from your side.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for that excellent presentation. We will go ahead and take some time for questions now. I will check if we have any questions. So far, no. So maybe I will have one question for you. It's really, I think it's the analysis, the problem which you presented is very important. So I have a very basic general question. How much the quality of the analysis can affect, has impact into the success of drug implementation or commercialization? How it is important?
Yes, I mean the model is first of all, it's a dynamic model. So if you do this analysis, let's say a preclinical, or that's quite difficult because you don't have much data about the future efficacy. But if you have phase 1 and especially phase 2, of course, but it's already phase 1, you may develop your own scenarios on the expected product profile, and then you can do the analysis. And of course, after phase 2, you can update the model. So you're applying really the value of information concept by every step. When you have more data, you plug it into the model and you rerun your analysis. So that's one thing which is important. Other thing is it also gives a trend in the outcomes. So it's the absolute values. Of course, there's uncertainty around that. So Of course, I cannot guarantee with this model 100% that you get that price in that position, but it gives you a clue about also the sensitivities. I only showed you some scenario analysis, but you can do a lot of sensitivity analysis just playing with the model and to get a comprehension of the trends. So that's probably even more important than the absolute values in the early stage. So and it also gives you, it's a tool to say, okay, if efficacy is really the impact in this analysis I shared, efficacy, especially overall survival, that is really key. So it may be more important to focus on, or at least to have an improvement on overall survival, so they have much more impact on the price than adverse events. So the trend in the direction is already important, and in this case, regardless of the outcome of the prices for third line, €100 higher or lower, it shows already here you really can have a problem unless you are able to maybe fine tune the trials in a way that you can increase your efficacy so that the ISO will drop, and also. So it's really a tool, an interactive, dynamic tool, which you can use all along the pathway of the drug development, and you can use it also as a biotech company, or if you are in a position to sell your product or your project to a big pharma company. Of course, the earlier in the phase, the more uncertainty, but you can assess the uncertainty, so the level of uncertainty, and that is important if a company is interested in acquisition of your company. So the company, you can show them indeed that what is the level of uncertainty and how are you anticipating on that, for instance, by improvement of clinical trial design, and that there is especially where you can come with, or even defining other outcomes, which in breast cancer is not so much the issue, but in orphan diseases, there are different ways of improving the clinical outcomes of your trial, besides the trial design itself. So increasing efficiency of your recruitment of patients. So all these measures in this model can be incorporated. So you can incorporate, let's say, efficiency, increase in efficiency. It show you then what is the impact for the net present value of the product. But you can also show the impact on the pricing potential, on the cost quality for the payer. So you can, in fact, integrate the perspectives and try to optimize. So that's a bit explanation into your a bit detailed, but this is how it works. It's not all about what is the outcome of the model. It's really a tool, interactive tool, which you can update, and you're applying statistics and, as I said, value of information concepts to fine-tune pricing and fine-tune positioning of a new product.
So I guess it is like a process of evaluation. It's not one, let's say, one event, one analysis, but you support your clients, investors during the, let's say, whole process of development, and also, I guess, during the implementation also, yep.
So it's not one project. No, it's really, when you do a submission, I do a lot of submissions for drugs, then it's resubmitting in, and then you have a positive answer, or you have some questions, you reply, and then the model is, and then it's reimbursed. But this is really, it starts in an early phase of development. In fact, I have an existing model, so I can modify it to the needs, the product specifics of the model of the drug in development, and then indeed you develop. You do the analysis, you have the input from the clinical team, but also already input from the marketing, from the strategic point of view. You incorporate it in the model, and then together you can run all the analysis. You play with the model, and that gives you ideas, ideas in an early phase, also on issues like clinical development of the study. Do we need to change the clinical trial design a little bit, which can have very high impact on the final outcomes, both for the investor but also for the payer. And after every phase, depending on, you can update the model and to see, okay, what are we going to change in the next step? So it's really a dynamic model, and in the end, you can use it in nearly time of launch, also for reimbursement purposes.
I have the last question because the evaluation is extremely fascinating for me. Because you said that the model is dynamic. Can you tell me who decides which factor, which outcome is the most important, which you should pay pay attention for this? Because you as experts in this kind of modeling, you decide how the factors, outcomes should be put into the model, or maybe investor will sometimes ask that for them this factor or this outcomes is the more important, it should be especially evaluated. So yeah, how it looks.
Yeah, we use different sources. Of course we use, first of all, experience in the field, both on the clinical area as well as the economic area. But of course, we start depending on the indication we reviewed. In this case, this was an original project where we reviewed the NICE websites in England, which all the evaluations in breast cancer, and we evaluated the German AMNOG website, which has also very detailed reviews and decisions on oncology drugs. So that is very important to know what are the issues in a disease area, and also not only the clinical issues, but also what is the health economic or the issues for reimbursement. So clinical issues, you see, for instance, what is the relevance of certain subpopulations, and how do you define subpopulations? And that's you really derive. There are many ways, and there you rely on previous assessments by NICE and AMNOG, for instance. And clinical, of course, you rely on internally on the clinical team. The clinical team, they have the in-depth knowledge about the product which is in development. And based on their experience, if they have a lot of experience in clinical development, they are the right persons to make also forecasts. So those internal data, and of course investors, depending on their risks in previous risks of experiences in critical economic valuation factors in that field, which can have an impact on the let's say on the economic valuation component of the project. There you also rely on internally, or the company or investors incorporate those components in. So it's really fine-tuning in fact all the areas, the clinical, the health economic, which is reimbursement, but also the economic valuation components for the investor. So it's integrating that from various experts and various disciplines and from various sources.
Thank you. Let me check if we have other question. It looks that we don't have another question. Mark, is there anything else you wanted to comment or add? No? Because it looks we are just finished. Do you want to add something or comment?
Yeah, what I want to add, depending on the audience, is if there is any interest with this model, it's especially in early phase development. It's important if you are at phase 3, then in fact, yeah, I don't want to say you are too late. Then still the model can be used to fine tune for the reimbursement, but ideally should. The breast cancer we did before, in fact, just after phase 2. So but also phase 1 is even more ideal, because then you can make your first assessments already, and by that fine tune the first steps in the model already. So the only thing I want to say is that to make it very simple is that you are never too early. You can only be too late to apply this method, this approach.
Once again, thank you for your very impressive and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. I will stop sharing now. Yeah, okay.